Welcome to our virtual Whalen Library event. Tonight, we're very excited to have Charles Moore here to speak to us about African American art, its history, legacy, the collectors who have supported Black artists, and about the business of acquiring and preserving a personal art collection. Uh, Charles Moore is a writer in New York City. He's the author of two books on art, The Black Market, A Guide to Art Collecting, and most recently, The Brilliance of the Color Black Through the Eyes of Art Collectors. Sorry, I think it was the Black Art Market, not the Black Market. In
No, you
addition,
got it, actually.
oh, it is the
It
Black
is,
Market.
yeah.
Okay, clever. Yes, awesome. Um, in addition, he's published works on Artnet, ArtFuse, Artsy, Digital Access to Scholarship at Harvard, and the World Monument Fund. He graduated from Harvard with a master's in museum studies and also holds a BS from Ferris State University and an MBA from St. John's. Thank you so much again to Charles for being here tonight. A couple Zoom housekeeping notes. We are recording this session for a possible broadcast on Wacom, our local cable access channel, and for the library's YouTube page. So you'll be able to watch and share this again. I'm recording my video, Charles's video, not yours. Charles will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, then we'll have time for questions and answers. So please stay muted through his talk, and then feel free to unmute at the end, or feel free to put your questions in the chat at any point and I will read them aloud. If you do unmute, just note that your voice will be part of the recording. So now that I've got those details out of the way, I will hand it over to Charles. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you all for being here, first and foremost. I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself and my history with art and collecting, and then I'll go into how I came to write my first book and a little bit about the most recent publication. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and my father was an engineer and my mother was very artsy and creative, even though she worked in real estate most of her career. And so my mother, took me to museums growing up. As far back as I can remember, I would say starting in middle school is some of my earlier experiences in museums with my mother. But I would say right towards the end of middle school is when she started collecting art. And when I think back on that, experience today, my mother probably wasn't so much an art collector as she was a person who wanted to decorate her home with art. And so we went, I escorted my mother to art museums and galleries and art fairs and festivals growing up. And so my, experience with art runs deep. And so when I got to college, I would say after, undergrad, I moved to New York City and I really started to, indulge into the art museums that New York City has to offer. So, my earliest experiences with the Met came almost on my first week living in New York City. I volunteered for a couple years at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and currently I'm a teaching fellow there. I've also volunteered at the Jewish Museum. But at that point, I still wasn't collecting art. And you fast forward to around 2008 is when I started my MBA at St. John's University. And I actually chose that university because of their relationship to Italy. And I'd always wanted to learn Italian, and St. John's University had a campus in Rome. So I moved to Rome. And you can imagine not just the amount of art I had the luxury of experiencing living in Rome, but just art from, 200, 300, 400, 500 years old. And, and if you've ever been to Rome, you'll know that you walk around long enough, you just stumble upon Caravaggios and random churches and, Bernini sculptures and Michelangelo paintings. And it's not just the Sistine Chapel. The entire city is filled with art from those three men along with others. And while living in Italy, which was around 3 years or so, I traveled all over, not just the country, but all over Europe. So I went to France and Germany and the UK and Spain, but also went to what I would call obscure countries that were never on my radar of places to travel, like Bulgaria, Romania, Czech Republic, Montenegro, and a list of others. And throughout this time, I just visited the countries and soaked up the culture, and especially I visited their art museums. And still at this point, I'm not collecting art. So I returned to New York City in 2012, and I watched a documentary called Exit Through the Gift Shop. And if you've ever seen that documentary, it's very interesting because there's an artist named Mr. Brainwash who follows around Shepard Fairey and Banksy, and he has years of footage documenting these street artists' work all over the country, and even in France and Italy. And so a couple of weeks after seeing that documentary, I was invited to a wedding in Boston, which was my first time visiting Boston. This wedding was at the Red Sox Stadium. And of course, I'm visiting Boston, so surprise, surprise, I stop into the local museums. And one of the museums was the ICA of Boston, where I literally exited through the gift shop and saw a Shepard Fairey print. And although I had never heard of this artist until this documentary, his name was fresh on my tongue. So I was excited to see that it was only $50. So that was the first piece of art I purchased. And the interesting thing about buying art for $50 is, I think art collectors or people who are art enthusiasts or people who are interested in becoming art collectors often see the headlines of a Warhol or a Basquiat that sells for millions of dollars, and your first assumption is, I have to be a millionaire or billionaire to be an art collector, which is far from the truth. So I come back to New York City, and I'm on Shepard Fairey's website almost daily, and I'm buying $50 prints and selling them on eBay. And then I, graduate, as I would call it, to art that was, in the $500 range, and then the $1,000 range, and then eventually into the $5,000 range. And I started to sort of buy this art. And, during this time, I'm working in banking. So, to buy those types of works or fine for my bank account at the time. But then I started to get so involved in buying and selling art. I was introduced to an art advisor who basically explained to me that my collection, in her viewpoint, wasn't really considered fine art. You can imagine how shocked I was to know that I have these, at this point I had, and this is, I would say around 2016. So I'd been collecting art for 4 years, and I had so much art at that time that I had 2 storage units full of art, and I sold art in auctions and on, private sales, and I really thought my collection was very interesting. So after having a series of conversations with her, I started to change the direction of how I collected art. And so I started to sort of look at artists who were going to some of the more prestigious art schools like Yale and Columbia and Hunter, Boston University, to name a few. And I started to collect work from those artists who were very young and emerging, but a lot of them historically would become the more famous artists that we know. And after I changed the direction of how I bought art, I also changed my interest in what I wanted to do for work. So because at that point I thought that I want to work in the art world at some form or fashion. So I went back to school and got a second master's, and that was 2017. I moved to Cambridge and finished that master's in 2019. And I started to read every single book there was on art collecting. And through that experience, after reading about 15 books on art collecting, I realized there was not a single book written by a Black author talking about Black collectors who are collecting the work of Black artists. And so at that point, I decided that was going to be the book that I was going to write, which is The Black Market Guide to Art Collecting. But I would say the most fascinating thing about this book is the way I wrote it. And although it is talking about Black art collectors who are collecting the work of Black artists, and it's written by me, a professor friend said to me after she read the book that you could actually cover up the word Black, and this could be a useful tool for anyone who wanted to collect art. And that was my intent. And my intent and the way I structured the book is really thinking about what tool could I have used in 2012 that would have helped me become a better art collector and not take 5 years for me to sort of change the direction of how I collected and why I collected and what I collected. And I also assumed that maybe people didn't have the same experiences I had, growing up around art, and also, living abroad and experiencing art in 20 different countries at least. And so the way I structured the book is sort of an introduction to why I wrote the book. And then if you were interested in Black artists in particular, because to me, this isn't a book about art history, but I wanted to give people a little bit of art history. The next chapter is me highlighting one Black artist from every decade from 1900 to 1990. And so I start with Norman Lewis, and I did this by year of birth. So 1909, Norman Lewis was born. If you've ever been to the Yale Art Museum in New Haven, Connecticut, they have a couple really incredible Norman Lewis paintings. Jacob Lawrence, born in 1917, Ed Clark. Currently, I am at Columbia University doing a doctorate in art and museum studies. And I am doing my dissertation research on Ed Clark. Faith Ringgold, who has an incredible painting at the MoMA, Howardina Pendell, who's a Yale MFA grad, Carrie James Marshall, who is the he is the artist, how do I want to say this? The living artist whose work sold the most at auction for Black artists. He sold a painting for $21 million. That's Carrie James Marshall, just to name a few. And then I go into books, because I think, one thing that I found that was very important is reading books, not just my book, but any book. And I talk about the types of books to read. And so this is not only just books about artists, their biographies, but monographs that include pictures, exhibition catalogs, because there's a history and some sort of literature in the form of a short essay about the artist in the exhibition, which will help you learn about the artist and their intent. Obviously going to museums, because that's what I grew up doing. But then I talk about the importance of art galleries, art auctions, art fairs, and art schools. And art schools, more importantly, as a place to meet the future greats early on in their career, to be able to support them, but also acquire works at a lower price point, because they're students, their work isn't going to be as high as if they were mid-career artists or mature artists. And then at the end of the book, there's 10 essays in which I have interviewed and profiled 10 Black collectors who have been collecting the work of Black artists for an average of, I'd say, around 3 to 4 years. And I chose people earlier on in their collecting endeavor for a particular reason, because this book is supposed to be approachable. And so instead of profiling collectors who have been collecting for 25 years, who are on museum boards, I thought that would be over in novice's head, and they wouldn't understand that type of language. And so I profiled people who have only been collecting for around 3 to 4 years. And that's the first book. And the second book, which is called The Brilliance of the Color Black Through the Eyes of Art Collectors, that book is sort of an extension to the first. So I make this assumption that you've either read the first book, or those techniques that I listed in the first book are a little bit 101 for your experience. And so the book is mostly filled with interesting essays about art. And there are also 10 collectors that are profiled, but these collectors have been collecting on average of around 30 years. And the majority of those collectors are pretty high profile collectors, 2 of them on the Art News 200 top collectors in the world list. Many of them are on major museum and art institution boards. And they are what I would call art patrons as opposed to art collectors. People who are patrons to the arts as opposed to just collectors of artworks. And because the book is called The Brilliance of the Color Black, one thing that I thought is one of the most interesting things that I did in the book is give a history of the color black as it is used in art throughout history, from caveman age until present. And that's the final chapter of the book. And that's my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What was the most interesting thing you found about the color black across the years, or something you didn't know before?
Well, I think speaking about Kerry James Marshall, who is what would be considered a modern master painter, and he uses the color black very often in his works. And he talks about using 4 types of blacks in his work. I think the most interesting thing is there's an artist that I really admire. His name is Mario Moore, no relation, although he is from Detroit and he went to the same high school We are not related. We checked. Um, he graduated from Yale in, I believe, 2013 with his MFA, which is considered the most prestigious art school in not only the country, but possibly the world. And he is a master painter, even at a very young age. And I sat down with him to discuss this book because I profiled him in one of the sections talking about, artists born from 1900 to 1990. He's the second from last profiled in the book. He's also in my collection, but we talked about the color black. And the most interesting thing that I learned from him is color theory and mixing paints, and just really understanding an artist that really is a master at their craft. And he paints with black, but he mixes different colors to make a black, and he never uses the actual color black.
Huh. Oh, wow. That's cool.
And so he calls himself the anti-Kerry James Marshall.
Anyone feel free to jump in with questions. I'll just keep asking mine until someone else jumps in. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like going from an MBA to the art world, and how what's helped you in that transition, or what from your MBA is helping you now.
That's a very good question, because when I decided to leave actually making money to not making money, all my friends and family thought I was crazy, and they, what's the first question when anyone goes to college and they're at the end of the line? You ask them what they plan on doing. So I got that question often. That's great that you're doing a second master's. Why are you doing a second master's? Why are you going to school again? And what do you plan on doing? And initially I thought I would utilize my finance background to start a hedge fund investing in art. And I spent a lot of money on lawyer fees to form a company, because hedge funds require a lot of documentation and a lot of licensing, and for the SEC and FINRA, et cetera. I formed this company with $40,000 in lawyer fees, and then decided to not do it, because I realized that was really just a different way of doing the same thing I was doing before. So when I graduated with my second master's in 2019 and had no clue how to answer that question, I just started to try things. And I was in the middle of my doctoral applications, which was like a full-time job. But I was sort of contemplating on what I wanted to do in the art world. And I thought doing a doctorate would help me buy some time. And so what I realized is I'm really good at a few things. And one of the things I'm good at is coming up with ideas that I think no one has thought of. And also seeing a project from start to finish. And that's what helped me write the first and the second and the third book. And I think, my MBA is what helped me sort of think about where I fit in as a round peg into a square hole, person who didn't start off. Most of the people in my field now have always knew they wanted to be in this field. There's rarely do you see a person who goes from banking to art. You typically see someone who go from art and decided they want to actually make money and go into banking. So I think what I've done that was very helpful was to sort of utilize those skills to sort of market projects or seek out funding and things of that nature. And also curating exhibitions, which is a little bit more lucrative than writing essays for magazines, for example.
Interesting. I'm wondering, having spent time in Boston, is there a certain collection or gallery or museum that you'd recommend folks check out to see specific Black artists or a good collection, something like that?
Well, because it's, honestly, because Black art is sort of trending right now, most of the museums will probably have something up that is interesting. If you were lucky enough to see Shabala Self's exhibition at the ICA, I think it's over, so it's a little late for that. But I'd say just keep your eyes open for exhibitions that are happening. I think there's an exhibition that will be happening in the next couple months at the MFA. Harvard often has at least a few works. I think it's sort of like think of Harvard as being like the little brother of anything, but like when you have the MFA and ICA and the Gardner, then, it's not always the first museum you think of in the Boston area.
Yeah.
But I would check out Harvard. If they still have they have a huge Carol Walker, who's a MacArthur Genius winner and then has won numerous awards for her work. They have a huge Carol Walker on display. I think it's probably still on display right now. And that's definitely worth a trip to the Harvard Art Museum.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does your work encompass importing African art or trading in African art?
So, I mostly work with artists that are either American or they're living or working out of America. But there's a project that I worked on that involved some African artists that I don't usually talk about a whole lot, but I think there's going to be some interesting things happening with this project, so I'm going to start talking about it more frequently. But I was part of a curatorial residency summer 2020. It's with a group called Art Is, and they're a New York-based Israeli organization. And I researched a group of Black Ethiopian Jewish artists that live in Israel. And I wrote a book that really is more so a collection of interviews as opposed to a book. And it's called Israel's Transformative Black Artists. And so I'm probably going to curate an exhibition with those artists later in the year, and do a couple probably magazine write-ups. I just got approval from one so far to do a magazine article on this group of artists.
Can you talk a little bit about the different markets or attitudes towards Black art in different places in the world? This is a very ignorant question on my part, but I would imagine it's very different in Israel.
Yeah, I think like anywhere, art is subjective and, depending on, who supports you is really who really gets, the spoils. And there's one artist in Israel in particular that was part of this project, Nerit Takale. I'll type her name in the chat. Hopefully I spell it correctly. But art is cyclical, and so you're seeing a lot of African-American artists, you know, exhibit their works in, especially I would say, Italy, France, and the UK. But you know, there's an artist that I'm exhibiting in a show in Los Angeles next week. He just had a huge solo with one of the top galleries in Austria, and he's a very young artist named Anthony Akimbola. And you know, it was written up in all of the newspapers in Vienna, and from what I've heard, the show is sold out.
Wow.
So I think, you know, and this has been probably maybe 4 or 5 years. Europe has been exhibiting a large amount of African-American artworks. And I think, you know, Asia is probably next to sort of get on the bandwagon.
Anyone else have any questions?
I see someone
Oh, there we go.
asked,
Yes.
are there Black women artists featured in your books? Yes. So in the first book, there, you know, in the section where I sort of feature 10 artists, there's Howardina Pindell, there's Faith Rengo, there's Renee Cox, who's a personal friend of mine, there's Shabala Self, who's also a friend of mine, but there's also Alyssa, I'm going to butcher her last name, so I'm just going to say Carter. She's has a Greek hyphen Carter last name. She is also featured in the book. There, and in the section where I feature the 10 collectors, there are also female collectors that I feature in the book as well.
Do you know Avis Robinson by any chance?
No.
Eugene Robinson's wife. On MSNBC, Eugene has this beautiful painting behind him every night, and it's his wife's painting, and I'm dying for that painting. But I understand she's going to have a show in New York soon, but I think that's about 2 orders. Avis Robinson, spouse of Eugene Robinson on MSNBC. Her stuff is great.
Yeah. She's coming up.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the big art shows and what role they sort of play in advancing some of the young artists, particularly like Art Basel in Switzerland and Art Basel Miami. And I think there's going to be a big show in Los Angeles in a couple of weeks.
Freeze next week.
Mm-hmm.
Those are art fairs, and they're very important because just like going to a particular university or working at a particular firm, it goes on your CV. And so for an artist to exhibit at one of the major fairs, there's all sorts of fairs and there's different levels, just like, you know, there's Goldman Sachs and then there's the regional bank, and, you know, it's more prestigious to work at Goldman Sachs. You know, it's more prestigious to go to NYU than it is to maybe, you know, Baruch College. So Art Basel and Freeze and the Armory and, you know, maybe 4 or 5 other fairs are considered the top art fairs in the world. And it's a big deal for them to have that listed on their CV. But still, at this moment, even though, you know, Black art is trending, there is not. When you actually go to those fairs, you realize how little Black artists are actually being, you know, showed at those type of places. So, yes, it's very prestigious to show at Frieze or Art Basel, Miami. But you don't see a whole lot of artists that are being shown there. It's starting to change. You saw a lot more at Art Basel, Miami this year, which is normally in December. And next week, I think you'll probably see a lot more at Frieze. A few of my friends are showing there.
And what sort of, what if someone is interested in either Black art or modern African art, like somebody like Abudia or somebody, that sort, or like Tony Shore, what galleries do you think would, if you were going to New York, what galleries would you visit?
Well, I think that's a long list, but I think Jack Shaman has historically been known to show, a little bit after the artist is emerging, Black artists. So they've shown Nina Chanel Abney, Titus Kaphar, Paul Anthony Smith. So there's Jack Shaman, there's Sean Kelly, for example, to name a couple of those galleries. Gallery Lalong in Chelsea. I would say you have to really just kind of go on their website and look at what their program is, because they're all different. But there are a few galleries, which are the ones I listed, that will show a lot of Black artists.
And I was wondering if you had seen the documentary, I think it came out last February on HBO. It was called Black Art in the History of Light, about the show at the Los Angeles Museum. I think, was it in the 60s? Maybe later.
Maybe 70s, yeah, maybe 80s. I think it was 80s.
Was it? Oh, that late. Okay.
Maybe it was, no, it was probably 60s or 70s, but it was David Driscoll, right?
I think so. Yeah. Well, I mean, it was like all the artists that were shown at that. There were like 60 artists, I think,
Right.
shown at that show.
Yeah,
It was very interesting for anyone else who's interested in it.
Yeah.
Can you say some more about Mr. Brainstorm? He shows up in a lot of the auctions that I kind of audit, and I can't figure out what his deal is.
I used to collect it as Brainwash.
It's Brainwash, right?
Yeah, I used to collect a lot of Mr. Brainwash, and I still, some of the art that I used to collect, I don't collect anymore. But because, I think it's a part of my collecting history, I will always keep some Mr. Brainwash in my collection, because I met him a few times, and he's a nice guy in person. But he initially started just as a guy who would follow around street artists, and he would would, as Shepard Fairey would say, he would call him every single night and say, "Where are we going?" And because Shepard Fairey was, a street artist who worked almost nightly, and it's probably one of the more famous street artists, Shepard Fairey and Banksy. But he, and Shepard Fairey was, classically trained. I think he went to RISD for art school. But, he would follow around these guys and document their work, and then he eventually became an artist. So it really just, depends on whether you're into that aesthetic. And, I think he's a very interesting person and makes some interesting art. I don't really know what else to say about him, but he's, he's interesting, I think. But he kind of floods the market with art.
Yeah.
So, so like the thing that I learned, sort of changing the way I collect is to understand, you know, why that's bad is an artist from whatever color who floods the market with art. You know, there's, you know, economics and supply and demand and scarcity. And, you know, Amy Sherrod is notoriously famous for only making a dozen works a year. If you don't know who Amy Sherrod is, she's the artist who painted Michelle Obama's portrait for the National Portrait Gallery. And that really changed her career. And now it's almost impossible to get work from Amy Sherrod, and the starting price is about $500,000. But, you know, there's something very interesting about an artist who makes very few works, or it's difficult to acquire their works because not everyone can have it. And obviously, as human nature, we always want things we can't have, and we're more interested in those things. So like you could look on Artsy and find hundreds and hundreds of Brainwash works that you could buy tomorrow.
Yeah.
And Amy Sherrod, for example, that would definitely not be the case. It would be much more of a challenge.
When you were writing about, in your first book, about the 3 to 4 year collectors and stuff, what would your general takeaway be about them? What did you find out when you interviewed them, and how would that shape your advice to somebody in that vein? You know, a couple of years of collecting and stuff.
Yeah, what I really sought to find is some diversity among collectors. And by that, I mean how they came to collecting. And you know, there's diversity among ages and gender, the educational background, bank accounts. And what I, you know, the main point I was trying to drive is anyone can be an art collector. If you're really interested in art and you want to collect art, you know, I profiled Everett Taylor, who's, you know, currently the CMO of Artsy. He's a twice college dropout. He started and sold to startups, and it started a collection. You know, he was mid-20s when he started his collection, and he probably has about $2 million in art in his collection, and he's only 30. But then there's a single mother who went to Princeton and is a lawyer, and you know, she is very educated and a high income earner, and she collects art, and she's been taking her daughter to museums since she was born almost. So really, I just wanted to sort of profile people who have not been collecting a long time, who come from different backgrounds, who started in different ways in different times in their life, and you know, did it in a diverse type of ways. They're how they discovered they wanted to be an art collector. So that was really kind of the intent, to profile in those types of collectors.
I wanted to have a sculpture card. That's what
And
got
then,
me
you know,
hooked.
and in the second book, that, you know, although these collectors had been collecting for a much longer time, I was less interested in things like when they started collecting and how they learned about art, which is some of the questions I asked the first group of collectors. I was more interested in why they collect, what they collect. You know, what's the difference between an art collector and an art patron in their eyes, and what's the importance of being on a museum board and helping start foundations and artist residencies, and, you know, supporting an artist when they're young to sort of take advantage of certain opportunities that they may not have the resources for. Notoriously Bernard Lumpkin, who is a very high profile collector. You Google his name, hundreds of articles come up. He's got a traveling exhibition, which includes, about 50 works in his collection. But like one story is like Alterance Gumby wanted to do this residency abroad, but he didn't have the money, and he had just graduated from Yale with his MFA. And instead of Bernard just giving him money, he bought out his studio, which for the artist kind of feels, there's he doesn't feel like he owes him anything, because everyone walked away with something. Bernard walked away with art, and Alterance walked away with the resources that he needed to take advantage of a residency. And speaking of important art fairs, if you look up Alterance Gumby today, he just recently had a sold out show at Art Basel. He's also showing at Frieze. He's also showing at Zona Maco in Mexico City. He has 2 studio assistants. He's in a number of museum collections, and I don't think he's even 33 yet. So he's doing quite well after, needing a few bucks to go to Italy.
Mhm.
And I'll put his name in the chat since it's a sort of challenging name to spell.
Thank you. We only have a few more minutes. I was interested in one of your book descriptions talked about how to store and preserve your art. Do you have any sort of basic, like you talked about, you had 2 storage units full. Is everything still in a storage unit, or how do you manage your collection?
Well, I think that, like some of the things I talk about in the second book, kind of touch on that, because, once you start collecting, and first thing you fill your walls, and then if you continue to collect, you have no more wall space. So where do you put the art? So I think, it's really important to store in a place that's climate controlled, temperature controlled, and really it controls things like humidity and the they kind of circumvent things like leakage and things like that nature, because the last thing you want are rodents gnawing at your art, or water leaking into the storage unit. So you really, like I always tell collectors, talk to your local art gallery and find out where they store their work, and that's where you go.
Huh.
But and also you just really want to make sure, the other things I talk about is like making sure your insurance is up to date, and going with the right art insurer is important. It sounds kind of like obvious, but I remember when Sandy happened, because I also collect watches and wine, and I collected those before I started collecting art. And I remember when Sandy happened in 2012, I believe, a couple of the storage units were destroyed because of the hurricane in New York City. And one of them in particular, because in Manhattan, if you know the city at all, it's a perfect grid, and everything was safe above 39th Street. And there was this one particular storage unit that was known to store a lot of wine collectors' collections. And a couple of the collectors had hundreds of thousands of dollars of wine and did not have insurance.
Wow.
And what people sometimes assume is like you put it in storage, it's insured. And what the storage unit will give you is, I think it's like a penny per pound or something to that tune. But it's some really obscure number that really has to do with the weight and nothing to do with the value. And that's what you get, you know, just as, you know, yeah, is your storage contract. So you have to have your own insurance.
To know. Any final questions for Charles?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you actually value art. Like, how do you decide what you're going to pay for a particular painting or piece of art?
Yeah, well, we could talk for 5 hours about that, because, you know,
It seems
art is,
very arbitrary to me.
it's known as being a very opaque market. So you really have no clue unless you're, you know, if you're a novice, I would say the best thing to do, if you have a lot of resources and you want to collect art, start with an art advisor. They would be your best friend, because they're studying the market daily, and their entire job is to find you the best art and get you the best price. And for what you pay the art advisor, you will actually save a lot of time and money, because they normally, wherever they acquire the work, usually ends up paying their fee, whatever you're paying them. Research is very important. So if you're buying art, I would say anything that's over $10,000 for a work, you should be doing a lot of research.
And where would you do that? I mean, where would you go to? Like auction records or?
So the best place to go for auction records, I would say, would be Artnet. And they have a service that you can pay for. It's about $50 a month for an individual. And with that service, you can look up the auction results of anything sold publicly. But that doesn't include things that are sold privately. So really, you know, and you know, part of the gallery's job, you know, if you're buying from art galleries, you're paying a premium because of that. But what you're actually paying for is they're supposed to be navigating that space with price and research and vetting the artists. And so what you're paying for is they've vetted that artist for you. They've determined that the fair market value for whatever they're selling is whatever they're selling it for. And so to go to an art gallery that is trusted is important. But that is really the point of buying from an art gallery or buying at an art fair, because everything is a little bit more public, even though they never have the prices. The more prestigious the fair, the less likely they're going to publicize the prices. So you'll have to inquire what the price is. And that's also why I talk about in the first book is, you know, starting with the art schools, because although, you know, it's less likely that those artists, you know, you're not getting Kehinde Wiley, that's King Kehinde of today. You're getting Kehinde Wiley, the 25-year-old who, you know, hopefully he still will be making art in 20 years. But, you know, so that's kind of sort of the risk you take in buying from an artist who's at an art school. You know, so you know, if your resources allow you, I would say start at an art gallery or work with an art advisor. That will help you navigate the opaqueness of prices.
There's just one more question in the chat about, do you collect any Black textile artists? This woman loves Bisa Butler and Sanford Biggers, and also thank you for your talk.
Oh, well, those are great. Those are great artists. I collect the work of an artist. I'm going to put his name in the chat. Anthony Akimbola. He's the artist that I had mentioned that has the show currently in Vienna. And he recently was in a group show at Pace Gallery, which is an international super gallery. And he's currently in a show on textiles at Hauser and Wirth, which is also an international super gallery. So he's a young artist, but he is making a lot of noise. And he is in the show that I'm curating during Freeze next week. So yes, I do have art from his work, and I have an artist, I don't know if you would call her work textiles, but you can look at it and decide for yourself. But I collect work from an artist who also went to Yale. And surprise, I keep on mentioning Yale because it's close by, and there's a lot of great artists that come out of that school. Lucia Hierro, who is a Dominican artist, and she works with fabrics to create a lot of her works. But Bisa Butler is incredible, and Sanford Biggers is one of the living greats.
Thank you. All right, folks, last chance. Any more questions?
Thanks so much.
Yes,
Yeah, thank
share
you.
that. Thank you so much for talking to us tonight. And
No
we have
problem.
2 of your books at the library, and they're also available online on Amazon or on Charles's website. And so thanks on behalf of the library, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you all for having me and listening to me babble.
It's very enjoyable. Okay, good night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.